He sat alone near gate 27, still as stone, hands folded, eyes fixed ahead, but not watching anything in particular. At 78, Frank Delaney didn't wear his story on his sleeve. It was in the way he moved, slow, measured, with a limp that never quite went away. It was in the soft tan jacket worn at the edges, the scarred knuckles, the quiet strength. He looked like just another old man on an early morning flight. But he wasn't. He was a Marine, a grandfather, a man who had already sacrificed more than most would ever know. He paid extra for that aisle seat, not for comfort, but because a war wound demanded it. And when they asked him to give it up for a family who needed to sit together, he didn't argue. He just stood, took his pain with him, and sat in silence between strangers. No one noticed. No one said thank you. But someone was watching. And what happened next, what the captain did, turned a forgotten sacrifice into something unforgettable. This is not just a story about a flight. It's a story about dignity, about honor, and what happens when someone finally stands up for both. Welcome to Grateful Stories. This is the story of Frank Delaney. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move to seat 32B, the flight attendant said. Her tone was crisp, firm, not unkind, but clearly not one to invite discussion. "There's a family that needs to sit together, and your seat is the only block available that can accommodate them." Frank Delaney looked up slowly from his aisle seat, the one he had reserved and paid extra for months in advance. He didn't speak right away, just blinked once behind weathered eyes that had seen too much of the world. His voice, when it came, was quiet, measured, with the edge of a man used to thinking twice before speaking. "I booked this for medical reasons." But the woman didn't budge, no hesitation, no offer of apology or empathy. "If you don't move, we won't be able to close the cabin doors," she pressed, urgency barely veiled beneath practiced professionalism. And so Frank stood, slowly, painfully. He gripped the seat back to balance himself, straightened with effort, then limped down the narrow aisle, his steps stiff and uneven. He settled into seat 32B, tucked between two strangers, in pain and alone. And not just physical pain. Something deeper had begun to settle in his chest. Disappointment, isolation, humiliation. 9 minutes passed. Then the cockpit door clicked open and the captain stepped out. What happened next shifted the entire flight, not just its mood, but its meaning. Frank Delaney had been at Denver International Airport long before the early boarding call echoed through Terminal C. The morning sun hadn't fully risen. It was just past 6:30. But Frank had already been seated at gate 27 for over an hour, hands calmly folded in his lap, back straight, boots planted firm on the floor. There was a quiet stillness about him, something that only came from a life lived with structure, with discipline, with sacrifice. At 78 years old, Frank wore the look of time like a well-earned medal, a soft tan jacket zipped up against the morning chill, creased black slacks, walking shoes that had clearly carried him over many miles. You wouldn't notice the limp right away, but if you watched closely, you'd see it. Left knee, stiff, not from age, from war. Frank had planned this trip for months. He was flying from Rock Springs, Wyoming to Annapolis, Maryland. His granddaughter, his pride, was graduating from the United States Naval Academy, the first member of the Delaney family to wear the uniform since him. He had sworn to be there. And he wasn't about to let pain or age keep him away, so he'd paid extra from his modest retirement, fixed income, military pension, so he could secure seat 14C, an aisle seat in premium economy. Not a luxury, a necessity. That seat meant he could stretch his leg, reduce the pressure on his knee, survive the 5-hour flight without agony. When his boarding group was called, Frank made his way down the jet bridge slowly, steadying himself with one hand on the railing. He nodded a soft thank you to the gate agent. No fuss, no entitlement. Just the quiet pride of a man who'd spent decades understanding the value of respect. He found his seat, lowered himself carefully, tucked his small green duffel beneath the seat in front of him, and exhaled. It was the first moment he'd felt relief all morning. But peace is a fragile thing. Up ahead, 3 rows forward, a commotion had begun to bubble. A passenger was trying to flag down a flight attendant. She was in her 30s, uniform crisp, smile rehearsed. Her name tag read Kayla. She leaned down to speak to someone, tapped quickly at the tablet in her hand, frowned slightly, then turned, her eyes locking onto Frank. She made her way toward him, her voice still soft, but more direct now. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "Are you seated in 14C?" Frank looked up, polite. "Yes, ma'am." She knelt a bit to his level, still smiling. "We have a family that got separated during booking, a mother and her two young children. They're all scattered through different rows. Your seat, along with the two beside it, is the only block available where they can sit together." Frank's brow furrowed just slightly. "This is my assigned seat," he said. "I chose it early because of a service-connected knee injury." Kayla didn't lose the smile, but there was the briefest pause. A beat. "I understand, sir. We really appreciate your cooperation." "It's just for this flight." Frank didn't move. He wasn't being difficult. He simply needed that seat. Without it, the next 5 hours would mean unbearable pain. His knee would swell. His back would lock. The ache would settle in like an old enemy. He glanced toward the front of the cabin. A mother stood in the aisle holding a toddler, with two other young children fidgeting nearby. He looked down at his own hands, scarred, steady, trained. Then he asked quietly, "What's the alternative?" Kayla tapped her screen again. "We can offer you seat 32B. He blinked. "That's middle row?" "Yes, sir. It's the only open seat left on the aircraft." He sat silently, letting the words settle. Seat 32B, no legroom, sandwiched between two strangers, back of the plane, by the lavatories, closer to turbulence. He knew the layout. He knew what it meant. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Frank said, voice calm but firm. "I really can't sit back there. My leg won't make it through the flight." Kayla's expression barely shifted, but the smile lost just a bit of its shine. "I do understand, sir," she repeated, "but we really need to seat this family together. If you choose not to move, we may not be able to depart on time." And there it was. The unspoken pressure, the threat of delay, a plane full of people waiting because of one man, one stubborn old man who wouldn't give up his seat for a mother with kids. Frank looked around. He could feel the shift. Passengers nearby were starting to look over. Conversations quieted, eyes turned. The weight of silent judgment began to settle on him like a second skin. A selfish man. A problem. He looked back at Kayla. "This is not acceptable," he said softly. "I'll note that, sir," she replied. "But I do need a decision." He drew a deep breath, let it out slowly. Then with quiet resolve, he unbuckled his belt. Bracing himself on the armrest, he stood up, slowly, with effort. He turned to Kayla, voice low but unshaken. "Name's Frank Delaney, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired. I'd like it noted that I gave up a medically necessary seat under pressure." She didn't respond beyond a quick nod, already waving the mother and her kids toward the newly available row. Frank gathered his bag and stepped down the aisle. As he passed, the toddler looked up at him and smiled. Frank returned the smile with a gentle nod. No resentment, no drama, just quiet resignation. Seat 32B was exactly what he expected. Narrow, cramped. One armrest was already claimed by a businessman who didn't even glance up. On the other side, a college kid sat with headphones in, lost in his music, oblivious to the world around him. The light above was flickering. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and burned coffee grounds. Frank lowered himself into the seat slowly, gritting his teeth as his knee bent tighter than it should. He didn't ask for help, didn't expect any. He rested his hands in his lap, leaned his head back, and closed his eyes. No one spoke to him. No one looked his way. But someone had seen. 3 rows ahead, across the aisle, a woman in her 40s sat quietly. She'd boarded just before Frank, laptop still resting in her lap, a tailored blazer folded neatly beside her. She had seen it all, every word, every silent refusal, every moment of dignity. And now she watched him, shoulders drawn inward, face etched deeper with fatigue than it had been 15 minutes earlier. She picked up her phone, not to post, not to rant, just to act. She typed a short message to a contact in airline customer relations. Someone she knew, someone who listened. Passenger Frank Delaney, forced to give up confirmed seat 14C despite medical need. Now in 32B, flight 306, crew dismissive. Please escalate. She hit send. Then she set the phone down and looked out the window. She didn't know what might come of it. But she knew this. Some moments demanded action, and silence was never the right response. In seat 32B, Frank Delaney sat still, hands folded over his stomach, his back slightly hunched. The middle seat always had a way of making you feel smaller. But this felt like fading, disappearing. His knee throbbed. Every few minutes, he shifted just enough to keep the joint from locking up completely. But there was no comfort to be found. There was no space left to move, no room left to be seen. Frank sat hunched in seat 32B, the tray table jammed inches from his chest. No room to stretch, nowhere to lean. The narrow aisle wasn't an option either. On his right, a college kid stayed glued to his screen, headphones on, oblivious. On his left, a businessman pounded away at his keyboard, elbow invading Frank's space like it was his right. Neither man spoke. No one acknowledged him, not with a glance, not even with a polite nod. But Frank wasn't angry. He was simply worn down. At 78, he'd long since accepted what it meant to be considered a burden. Being overlooked wasn't new. 3 rows ahead, Charlotte Hayes, poised in her blazer, hadn't reopened her laptop. She watched him quietly, sensing something the others missed. Her gaze lingered on his hands, broad, knuckles swollen, one finger bent awkwardly. Not from age, from injury. They rested motionless on his lap, but the tension beneath the skin was there, unmistakable. He wasn't just sitting, he was holding something in. Not rage exactly, not even pain, something heavier. When the flight attendants made their way down for final checks, no one spared Frank a second glance. No apology, no kindness, just brisk nuns, tugging on bins overhead, brushing by him like he didn't exist. Charlotte's phone buzzed in her palm. A message. Forwarding to ops, unacceptable. Will notify cabin if escalated. It wasn't much, but at least someone was trying. Then the cabin doors sealed shut. The thud echoed like a verdict. The safety demonstration began, a blur of oxygen masks and seatbelts and trays. But Frank heard none of it. Instead, there was a different hum in his ears, one from decades ago. The jungle, the slap of boots in the mud, a young man's panicked voice screaming for a corpsman. Then the crack of gunfire, and the moment his knee gave out, shattered. He shifted in his seat and grimaced, tried to rest his arm, but the businessman's elbow didn't budge. Frank said nothing. He didn't expect courtesy anymore. In the cockpit, Captain David Miller adjusted his headset. A man shaped by 23 years in the Air Force and over 11,000 hours in the air. Every movement was precise, deliberate. He listened as his co-pilot called off pre-flight checks. Ground control had cleared them. Then his screen blinked. A red alert. Passenger concern flagged by corporate liaison. He tapped it. Frank Delaney, Flight TC-306. Veteran displaced from medically required seat. Below it, Charlotte Hayes, Diamond Elite PR Board Advisor. Delaney, the name landed like a strike to the chest. He turned sharply. Hold taxi, he ordered. The co-pilot blinked. Captain? But David was already unbuckling. Hold position. I'll be back in 3. He stepped into the narrow cabin corridor, found Arlene, the senior flight attendant. Where's the passenger moved from 14C? She pointed toward the back. Relocated for a family. He's in 32B. David gave a single nod. No flare of emotion, just purpose. He straightened the cuffs of his uniform, smoothed the gleaming gold stripes, and walked. Charlotte noticed first. So did the cabin. Energy shifted as the cockpit door opened. Conversations quieted. Phones lowered. David Miller didn't command attention. He earned it. He moved steadily, scanning faces, focused, until he reached row 32. Frank was half dozing when the shadow fell over him. He looked up and froze. A tall man in crisp uniform stood before him. Flight bars, silver wings. And then, without hesitation, Captain David Miller raised his right hand and gave a formal salute. Silence swept the aisle. Frank stared up, uncertain, eyes searching. Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney, David said, his voice low but firm. On behalf of Transcontinental Airlines and as a fellow serviceman, I offer you my deepest apologies. Frank blinked slowly. You should not have been asked to give up your seat. That was a mistake, and we're going to make it right. Passengers leaned in, whispers rising. Someone slowly lowered a tray table, not wanting to miss a second. David turned. Is Ms. Kayla Bennett in the cabin? The young flight attendant stepped forward pale. Yes, Captain. You will personally escort Staff Sergeant Delaney to seat 1A. She hesitated. Captain, first class is, if 1A is taken, David said, not raising his voice, you will ask for a volunteer. If no one volunteers, inform them the captain is requesting that seat for a decorated combat veteran. Frank began to rise, but David gently raised a hand. Please, let us fix this. It's the very least we can do. Frank sat there, stunned. Charlotte saw it, disbelief flickering across his face, then something else. Recognition. Gratitude. He stood slowly, carefully, that knee failing him just a bit. David reached under his elbow to steady him. The businessman beside Frank shifted, awkward now. The college kid finally removed his headphones, shame blooming on his face. They began to walk. David glanced back once. His eyes met Charlotte's. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Charlotte sat back, her hands clasped tightly. Something inside her loosened, something old and stubborn. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stood up. Frank stepped into the aisle. No announcement was made. No speech delivered. But the air shifted. People moved. The businessman, who'd ignored him all flight, sat straighter. The college kid mumbled, "Sir, sorry, sir," as he stood. Frank didn't ask for anything, never had. Captain Miller didn't release his elbow until Frank stood tall again. Ahead, Kayla stood frozen, tablet clutched tight. Miss Bennett, David said calmly, seat 1A, now. Her voice was barely audible. Yes, Captain. She turned and walked. Frank followed, slowly, stiffly. Each step a battle, but now with dignity. Each row they passed seemed to lean forward. Some whispered, some simply watched. One man, cap on his lap, reached up and laid a hand to his heart. A quiet salute. Charlotte didn't move. She didn't lift her phone. She just watched, tears quietly gathering. The plane hadn't left the runway, but something far more important had already taken flight. The plane hadn't moved an inch, but something had shifted in the air, like the moment just before a storm breaks. As they reached the front, the stillness deepened. Kayla stopped at row 1. She turned, addressing the man already seated in 1A, a sharply dressed passenger with a polo shirt crisp as hotel linen, sipping from a bottle of designer water, blissfully unaware of the weighty moment unfolding behind him. Her voice held a tremble now, stripped of its earlier authority. I'm sorry, sir, she said with a hesitance that was new to her. We need to reassign your seat. The man blinked, confused. Wait, what? At the captain's request? Then he turned and saw Frank. Really saw him, the aging Marine with a weathered face, a duffel bag that had traveled through more than just airports, and that unmistakable look of quiet endurance. Something in the man's expression changed. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for explanations. He simply stood. Sir, he said softly with no flourish, no fuss. It's an honor. Frank opened his mouth, unsure what to say. Nothing came out. So instead, he dipped his head in gratitude, eyes glinting with something too old for words. Captain David Miller looked back at Kayla. His voice, when it came, was strong enough for the whole cabin to hear. If that seat hadn't been offered, he said clearly, I would have moved my co-pilot from his jump seat. He paused. And if that hadn't worked, I would have given up mine. Kayla's mouth parted slightly, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. That wasn't for her. That was for everyone else. And now everyone was listening. Frank eased down into the seat in 1A, leather wrapped around him like a quiet embrace. Not just comfort, but dignity, a place of peace. One of the crew brought him a soft blanket, a chilled bottle of water, and a gentle apology. But those weren't the things that undid him. It was a voice, a few rows back, raw and uncertain. A man stood, late 30s, clean-shaven head, hoodie and jeans. His voice trembled. Staff Sergeant Delaney. Frank turned, his tired eyes finding the speaker. I served under you, the man said. Camp Leatherneck, 2006. Frank stared, trying to place the face. Then slowly his expression softened with recognition. Corporal Reeves, he murmured. You saved my life, the man said, voice cracking. We never got to thank you. Reeves blinked hard, fighting back the emotion. He couldn't find more words. He just nodded, chest rising sharply, and sank back into his seat. Silent tears trailed down his cheeks. Frank looked away, jaw clenched, but the silence had shifted again. Not tense now, solemn, reverent. Captain Miller stepped into the intercom alcove. He flicked the switch and began to speak, his voice steady and purposeful. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, before we take off, I need to make a short announcement. The entire cabin turned toward his voice. Earlier today, a mistake was made. A man who served this country, who carries the visible and invisible scars of that service, was asked to give up his seat, not due to any error by the crew, but because of a policy that chooses convenience over honor. He let the silence fill the space. Let me be absolutely clear. We do not take off while injustice sits quietly among us. Not a sound stirred, not even a cough. This man, Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney, is a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. He fought at Khe Sanh in Vietnam. He wore the uniform before many of us were even born. He didn't ask for anything special, just to keep the seat he booked, so his leg wouldn't lock up from an old combat wound. Another pause. The words felt heavier now. We failed him. Miller's voice softened slightly, but never lost its edge. But we don't leave our own behind, not in battle, not at 30,000 feet. His eyes swept the aisle toward Charlotte, who sat frozen, her eyes wet, toward the tearful Marine in row 4, toward the passengers who, moments ago, had looked away but now sat up straighter. And if that means this flight arrives 10 minutes late, he said with quiet pride, then I'll carry every one of those minutes without regret. He turned off the mic, and for a second, no one moved. Then, from somewhere mid-cabin, a slow clap began. It wasn't theatrical, it wasn't rushed. Just one pair of hands, then another, and another, rippling forward like a rising tide. Not thunderous, but deep and resonant. Frank didn't lift his hand, he didn't bow, he simply sat there, still, composed, seen. Charlotte brushed the corner of her eye, and in that moment, something returned to her. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Honor doesn't vanish. It just waits for the moment to rise again. The wheels touched down in Annapolis just after noon. Sunlight bathed the cabin as the plane slowed, casting golden light through the windows like a quiet benediction. As the passengers gathered their bags and rose, Frank remained seated in 1A, hands calm on his knees. He wasn't in a rush. For the first time in years, he didn't feel overlooked. The flight attendants thanked him at the door, not with forced politeness, but with sincerity. And when Charlotte passed him on the jet bridge, she paused. Her hand touched his shoulder gently. You reminded all of us who we're supposed to be, she whispered. Near baggage claim, a midshipman stood waiting, her uniform perfect, posture proud, a handmade sign in her hands. Welcome, Grandpa Frank. She spotted him limping toward her and dropped the sign instantly. She ran, full speed. He didn't brace. He let her collide into him, arms wrapped around his ribs like waves crashing into a seawall. Your knees, she cried, pulling back. I've had worse, he chuckled. And for the first time in too many years, that smile reached all the way to his eyes. They sat for hours that afternoon, catching up. He asked about her classes, her ship assignment, her future plans after commissioning. She asked what had happened on the plane, puzzled by the buzz of messages and news pings already lighting up her phone. Frank kept it simple. I had a bad seat, he said, and someone stood up. She nodded slowly, but later that night she watched the video online, the one someone had recorded of Captain Miller's speech, and she cried. Then she hugged her grandfather again, and this time she didn't let go. A week later, a letter arrived, Transcontinental Airlines. Inside, a formal apology, a full refund, and a card. Dear Mr. Delaney, as of today, you are designated a lifetime guest of honor with Transcontinental Airlines. No booking codes, no change fees, no hassle. Just tell us where you're going. We'll get you there. TCA Veterans Council. He folded the letter twice and placed it beside the flag in his study. He didn't say a word. 2 weeks after that, another envelope came. Handwritten address. The seal read, Department of the Army, Office of Military Records. Inside was a short typed note. A retired officer working in archives had reopened his personnel file after a public inquiry. There they had found a long misplaced action report from February 1968, Quezon. It detailed how Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney, under intense enemy fire and with a shattered knee, had pulled 6 wounded Marines from a burning vehicle, alone. The file had been marked incomplete, then lost in the chaos of that brutal year. But now it was fully restored. At the bottom, a signature, General James E. Lockhart, and behind the note, a second page, handwritten. Frank, I was Corporal Turber 3. You pulled me out. Turber 3 in that vehicle. You don't know me, but I've carried your memory every day since that moment. I'm alive because of you. I got to go home. I built a family. I made a life, and all of it, every breath, every moment, was made possible because a Marine who limped more painfully than I ever did refused to let go. Thank you. You were never invisible. Not to us. General J. Lockhart, USMC Ret. Frank Delaney sat with the letter resting in his lap, his eyes lingering on the words long after he had finished reading them. The silence in the room was thick, almost reverent, broken only by the soft sound of his breathing. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just sat there, letting the weight of decades collapse into that one piece of paper. Something deep inside him stirred, like the slow unfurling of a memory he had long buried beneath layers of time and silence. Miles away, inside a modest home office in Richmond, Virginia, Charlotte Hayes's fingers moved rhythmically over her laptop keyboard. Her expression was focused, her thoughts clear. She didn't embellish anything. She didn't reach for emotion or dress up the truth. She just wrote what she had witnessed. The man asked to surrender his seat, the captain who wouldn't let it happen. The hush that fell over the cabin before it rose into a spontaneous standing ovation. She submitted the piece to a small, regional publication. It got picked up. Local news stations ran the story first. Then the national outlets followed. By the end of the week, headlines across the country were repeating the same words. The salute at 32B. It echoed in school auditoriums as principals read it aloud to students. It was printed, laminated, and pinned to bulletin boards in over 100 veterans of foreign wars halls across America. And then there was the photo. Frank Delaney seated in 1A, his head gently bowed, sunlight falling softly on the backs of his weathered hands. That image, quiet and unassuming, became something people couldn't stop looking at, not because it symbolized fame, but because it symbolized memory. It stood for something deeper, a recognition that so many had waited too long to receive. Frank didn't become someone else after that week. He didn't buy a new house. He didn't hire an agent. He didn't suddenly become a name trending online. He still lived in the same modest home in Rock Springs, Wyoming. He still drank his coffee, black and bitter, the way he always had. He still limped his way to the mailbox every morning, even when the pain was sharp and the cold bit through his knees. But something had changed. He carried himself a little differently now. His chin tilted just slightly higher when he walked down the street. When strangers approached him, some hesitant, some emotional, he didn't pull away. And sometimes, at dusk, when the sky painted gold across the hills and he sat quietly on the front porch with his hands folded in his lap, he would smile. Not because he needed praise, but because for the first time in a very long time, he felt seen. Truly, wholly seen. Not every sacrifice gets carved into a medal. Not every battle ends with trumpets or flags raised high. But every now and then, all it takes is a single voice to say, "We remember." And when that voice rises, something as simple as a seat on an airplane becomes more than just a seat. It becomes a symbol, a return to dignity, a return to honor, a return to home. Even in our darkest hours, kindness still finds a way in. Sometimes it shows up quietly, tucked between strangers and unspoken gestures. Not everyone who chooses to help seeks the spotlight. Some people only want to be sure that today, someone else isn't hurting, that someone makes it through. And sometimes that alone, that quiet, resolute kindness, is enough to change the course of another person's life forever. You might forget the story. Time has a way of dulling details. But if no one tells it again, if no one keeps it alive, then the silence becomes permanent. So tell it. Tell it for the ones who were never thanked. Tell it for the ones who never asked to be seen but deserve to be. Tell it because, even in a crowded world, every act of quiet heroism matters. This is why stories like this must live on, where justice is upheld, kindness remembered, and no moment of silent courage is ever left behind.